April 18, 1943. Shortland Island, Solomon Sea. The wreckage still smoked when Lieutenant Commander Takeo Shibata climbed through the twisted metal frame. Salt spray from the nearby breakers mixed with the acrid stench of burnt rubber and aviation fuel. His boots crunched on shattered plexiglass as he approached what remained of the American fighter. A P-38 Lightning that had crashed into the jungle canopy 2 days earlier after a running dogfight with 3 Zeros. Shibata knelt beside the starboard engine nacelle, running his fingers along the scorched aluminum skin. Even in death, the machine radiated a kind of brutal elegance. 2 engines, 2 booms, a central nacelle housing the pilot between them like the head of some mechanical insect. He'd seen lightnings before, brief glimpses as they screamed past at impossible speeds, or distant silhouettes at altitudes his Zero couldn't reach. But never this close, never still enough to understand. Behind him, 3 naval engineers picked their way through the debris field. Captain Jiro Horikoshi, no relation to the famous Mitsubishi designer, carried a leather-bound notebook already half filled with sketches. Beside him, 2 junior technicians from the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal began photographing everything. The crushed cockpit, the peculiar tricycle landing gear, the twin tail booms that seemed so wasteful, so unnecessarily complex. "Look at this," Shibata called out, gesturing to the engine. The cowling had torn away during impact, exposing the Allison V7 1910 in all its intricate glory. Horikoshi crouched beside him, his eyes widening behind wire-rimmed spectacles. The engine was massive compared to the Nakajima Sakai that powered the Zero. 12 cylinders arranged in a V configuration, each precisely machined. But that wasn't what made Horikoshi's breath catch. Mounted behind the engine, connected by a complex network of ducts and pipes, sat something that looked almost like a second, smaller engine. "General Electric turbocharger," Horikoshi murmured, tracing the exhaust manifold with one finger. "Type B2. I've read about these in technical journals, but..." He paused, calculating in his head. "This must generate sustained boost at 25, perhaps 30,000 feet. Shibata didn't fully understand the engineering, but he understood altitude. He'd been a fighter pilot for 4 years, had flown combat missions from China to the Philippines to New Guinea. And he understood, with the certainty of lived experience, that whoever controlled the sky above 20,000 feet controlled the battle. The Americans have been doing exactly that for months now. "How do we not have this?" one of the junior technicians asked. The question hung in the humid air like an accusation. Horikoshi stood, wiping grease from his hands onto a handkerchief. "We do have turbochargers. The Army's Key 44 uses them. But not like this. Not with this power density, this reliability." He gestured at the installation with something approaching reverence. "They've made it standard. Every P-38 has 2 of these. That means every Lightning pilot can climb to 30,000 feet and stay there, running at full power, for hours." Shibata moved to the port engine, which had survived the crash more intact. The propeller blades were bent backward from the impact, but the reduction gearbox was visible where the spinner had torn away. He noted the direction of rotation, then moved to the starboard side. Counter-rotating propellers. Of course, it explained the Lightning's legendary stability, the way they could snap from a dive to a climb without the torque roll that plagued single-engine fighters. "They've eliminated every problem we're still fighting," Horikoshi said quietly. He'd moved to the central nacelle, where the cockpit canopy lay shattered across the jungle floor. "Look at this instrument panel." He pointed to the twisted remains of the dashboard. Even destroyed, the sophistication was evident. Multiple engine gauges for each power plant. Radio equipment more advanced than anything in Japanese service. A modern gun sight mounted above a yoke rather than a stick. Another innovation that allowed steadier aim. The concentrated armament was even more striking. In the Lightning's nose, they found 4 Browning 50 caliber machine guns and 1 Hispano 20mm cannon, all pointing forward, all converging on a single point. No need to calculate convergence angles. No bullets crossing paths at wildly different ranges. Just point the aircraft and fire. The American pilot could open fire from 800 yards and expect hits. "Our Zero carries 2 rifle-caliber machine guns in the cowl and 2 20mm in the wings," Shibata said. "The cannons are powerful, but the synchronization gear reduces rate of fire, and the wing mounting means—" He trailed off. They all knew what it meant. Japanese pilots had to get close, sometimes suicidally close, to ensure their weapons hit. Horikoshi was photographing the gun installation when they heard voices approaching through the jungle. A squad of naval infantry appeared, led by a lieutenant who looked barely 20. "Commander Shibata, Admiral Kusaka wants your preliminary report by 1800 hours. The wreckage is being prepared for transport to Rabaul tomorrow." Shibata nodded. Rabaul, the great fortress base that had become a graveyard for Japanese air power. The Lightnings had been raiding it for months, sweeping in at 28,000 feet where the Zeros and Oscars couldn't follow, escorting the heavy bombers that turned hangars and fuel dumps into infernos. Now he understood why. As the afternoon sun slanted through the canopy, Horikoshi assembled his notes. Shibata watched him work, watched him sketch the turbo-charger installation with the precise hand of a man who understood that he was documenting not just a machine, but a philosophy. The Americans had chosen power over agility, altitude over maneuverability, overwhelming, firepower over elegant efficiency. And in the vast distances of the Pacific Theater, where battles were won by whoever could fly higher, faster, and farther, they'd been proven devastatingly right. "We need to show them this," Horikoshi said finally, closing his notebook. "Tokyo needs to understand what we're facing." Shibata nodded, but his eyes remained on the wreckage. Somewhere in that twisted metal was a lesson his commanders needed to learn. The Zero was a beautiful aircraft, light, agile, with a range that had shocked the world at Pearl Harbor. But beauty and agility didn't matter when the enemy could simply climb above you and choose when, where, and if to fight. He thought of the pilot who died in this cockpit. The Americans were losing planes, yes, but they were learning. They'd stopped trying to dogfight, stopped trying to beat the Zero at its own game. Instead, they'd built something that didn't need to dogfight. Something that could escort bombers to any target in the Pacific and swat away defenders like insects. The sun was setting when they finally left the crash site. Behind them, infantry began dismantling what remained of the P-38, preparing to ship the pieces back to Japan. Shibata wondered what the engineers in Nagoya or Mitsubishi's Nagoya plant would make of it. Would they see what he saw? Would they understand that this wasn't just a technical problem to be solved, but a fundamental mismatch in industrial philosophy? The Americans were building complex machines because they could, because they had the factories, the trained workers, the vast aluminum foundries, and precision tool shops that could produce turbochargers and counter-rotating propellers and concentrated armament by the thousands. Japan had built the Zero beautiful and light because it had to, because its factories couldn't produce anything more complex in sufficient numbers. That night, in his quarters at the Shortland Island airfield, Shibata wrote his report by lantern light. He detailed everything they'd found, everything that made the P-38 superior. He knew the report would travel up through layers of command, would be read and filed and probably dismissed by officers who still believed in the samurai spirit, who thought that superior will could overcome superior machinery. But he also knew that somewhere, someone would read his words and understand. Someone would see the truth that was becoming clearer with each passing month. The Japanese Empire was fighting an industrial war with artisan weapons. And unless that changed, unless Japan could match the Americans' production and technological sophistication, the beautiful agility of the Zero would be nothing more than a graceful death. May 3rd, 1943. Yokosuka Naval Air Technical Arsenal, Kanagawa Prefecture. The reassembled P-38 Lightning sat in the center of Hangar 7 like a captured dragon. Technicians had spent 2 weeks piecing together what the jungle and impact forces had torn apart. Welding, fractured spars, replacing sections too damaged to salvage with carefully measured replicas. It would never fly again. But it didn't need to. It just needed to testify. Commander Minoru Genda stood before it with 20 naval officers, their faces illuminated by the harsh overhead lights. Genda, the brilliant tactician who'd helped plan Pearl Harbor, walked slowly around the aircraft, his limp barely noticeable now, 2 years after the wound that had nearly killed him at Midway. He stopped at the starboard engine, where the turbocharger installation had been exposed, cut away to reveal the internal workings like an anatomy lesson. "Gentlemen," Genda began, his voice echoing in the vast hangar. "What you're looking at represents a problem we can no longer ignore." He gestured to the turbocharger. This single component, this turbine driven by exhaust gases, changes everything about high-altitude combat. At 25,000 feet, a Zero Sakai engine produces perhaps 60% of its sea-level power. At 30,000 feet, barely half. He tapped the turbocharger housing. This machine maintains full power, 1,475 horsepower per engine. Up to 28,000 feet. Perhaps higher. Captain Horikoshi stepped forward, opening his notebook. "We've analyzed the materials, sir. The turbine blades are forged from a nickel-chromium alloy we believe requires specialized vacuum furnaces. The bearings are precision ground to tolerances we can achieve, but not in production quantities. The ducting alone requires manufacturing techniques that would..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "That would strain our current industrial capacity." An older captain from the Naval General Staff, Ryutaro Yamanaka, a conservative who'd opposed the Pearl Harbor attack, cleared his throat. "You're saying we cannot build this?" "I'm saying, sir, that we could build one," Horikoshi replied. "Perhaps 10, perhaps 50, if we diverted resources from other programs. But the Americans are building thousands. They've designed this system to be manufactured on assembly lines by workers with moderate training and quantities that boggle the mind." Genda moved to the nose section, where the concentrated armament had been laid out on a nearby workbench. 4 50-caliber Brownings, each capable of 800 rounds per minute. 120mm Hispano cannon with a slightly slower but devastating rate of fire. 750 kilograms of weaponry, he said, all pointing forward, all fed from ammunition bays in the nose, where weight is centered. He looked at his officers. Compare this to our approach. The Zero carries two Type 97 7.7mm guns in the cowl, synchronized to fire through the propeller arc, which immediately reduces their rate of fire by 30%. We mount two Type 99 20mm cannons in the wings, which creates convergence problems and places weight far from the aircraft's center of mass. Our younger lieutenant spoke up. Saburo Sakai's wingman, recovered from wounds and assigned to technical evaluation duties. But sir, the concentrated armament adds enormous weight to the nose. The P-38 must be nose-heavy, sluggish in pitch. Watch, Genda said. He nodded to a technician, who activated a hydraulic lift. The P-38's nose rose smoothly, revealing the twin boom structure beneath. The engines are far aft, behind the center of gravity. The tail surfaces are far aft. The pilot sits at the center of mass, with all the weapons ahead of him. He pointed to the empty engine nacelles visible on either side. This is not a nose-heavy aircraft. This is a carefully balanced one. The Americans have used the twin boom configuration to solve problems we didn't even know existed. Horikoshi flipped through his notes. The counter-rotating propellers eliminate torque effects. The tricycle landing gear provides excellent visibility during ground operations and reduces landing accidents. Our intelligence suggests the P-38's landing gear failure rate is 1/10 that of conventional tailwheel designs. The twin engines provide redundancy. We've confirmed multiple incidents where Lightnings returned to base on a single engine after combat damage that would have downed any single-engine fighter. And the range? Yamanaka asked quietly. Genda's expression darkened. With drop tanks, operational radius of 750 miles, combat radius of 450 miles at full power. They can escort bombers to Rabaul from Guadalcanal, fight for 20 minutes over the target, and return with fuel to spare. He let that sink in. Gentlemen, we designed the Zero to fight over China, where airfields were close and missions were measured in dozens of miles. The Americans have designed the Lightning to fight across the Pacific, where distances are measured in hundreds of miles. Once again, they've built the right weapon for this war. The hangar fell silent except for the distant sound of aircraft engines being tested in adjacent buildings. Shibata, who'd been standing to one side, recognized the sound. Sakai engines, the same type that powered the Zero. Reliable, efficient, lightweight, and utterly inadequate for the war they were now fighting. A naval captain from the Material Bureau spoke up. What about the J-2M? The Raiden is designed specifically for high-altitude interception. Surely, the Raiden prototype has been in development for 2 years. Genda interrupted. It still suffers from engine overheating and landing gear problems. Even if we resolve these issues, even if production begins next month, we're asking a single-engine fighter to do what the Americans accomplish with 2 engines and turbocharging. We're asking our pilots to fly longer, higher, and harder in machines that give them no margin for error. He walked to the P-38's cockpit, now open to expose the interior. Look at this. He pointed to the seat. Armor plating behind the pilot. Bulletproof glass in the windscreen. Self-sealing fuel tanks in both booms. We've examined them. They're filled with a rubber compound that automatically seals bullet holes. He turned to face the assembled officers. The Americans are protecting their pilots because they understand that a trained pilot is more valuable than an aircraft. We send our pilots to war in machines without armor, without self-sealing tanks, because we convinced ourselves that weight saved equals performance gained. And it does, Yamanaka said. The Zero can outmaneuver. The Zero can outmaneuver an opponent who chooses to dogfight, Jenda said sharply. The Americans are no longer making that choice. They've analyzed our tactics, studied their own losses, and adapted. The P-38 pilots have standing orders. Never engage in turning combat with Japanese fighters. Use altitude, speed, and firepower. Dive from above, fire, extend away, climb back to altitude. Repeat until the enemy is destroyed or runs out of fuel. He gestured broadly at the Lightning. This machine is designed for exactly that type of combat. It accelerates quickly in a dive. It climbs quickly after an attack. It can sustain high speeds at altitude for extended periods. And when the pilot does open fire, he has 7 times the weight of fire of a Zero, all concentrated on a single point. Jenda's voice grew quieter, more intense. Gentlemen, we're not just behind in technology. We're behind in tactical philosophy. The Americans have designed their entire combat system, aircraft, tactics, training, around a realistic assessment of Pacific warfare. We're still flying on the assumptions we made in 1940. A commander from the Yokosuka training program raised his hand. What about pilot quality? Our pilots have more experience, better training in aerobatics. Had more experience, Jenda corrected. We've lost hundreds of our best pilots over Guadalcanal, New Guinea, the Solomons. The Americans are training new pilots by the thousands. Not to our standard, perhaps, but to a consistent standard. They're giving those pilots aircraft that compensate for inexperience with technical superiority. A mediocre American pilot in a P-38 is deadlier than a good Japanese pilot in a Zero, because the Lightning allows him to engage only on favorable terms. Horikoshi was studying the propeller hubs, where the counter-rotation mechanism was visible. We need to understand, sirs, that this aircraft represents a manufacturing philosophy we cannot match. Not because Japanese engineers are less capable, but because American industry is structured differently. They design for mass production from the beginning. They accept complexity if it can be mass-produced. They have specialized factories making nothing but turbochargers, nothing but propellers, nothing but electrical systems. These components arrive at the final assembly plant, already tested and ready to install. While we, Shibata added quietly, build each aircraft almost individually. Skilled craftsmen hand-fitting components, making adjustments, solving problems one airplane at a time. Jenda nodded. Artisan production versus industrial production. In 1941, artisan production was enough because we had superior pilots, and they didn't expect the attack. Now, he shook his head. Now we need to produce 1,000 fighters per month, and we're struggling to build 300. Now we need to match the P-38's capabilities, and we're still flying improved versions of the Zero. Now we need to protect our pilots, and we're telling them that armor is cowardly, that the samurai spirit will carry them through. The hangar had grown darker as evening approached. In the shadows, the P-38 looked less like a defeated enemy and more like a prophecy. Yamanaka walked slowly around it one more time, his face unreadable. "What do you recommend?" he asked finally. Jenda exchanged glances with Horikoshi and Shibata. "Short term, we need to change our tactics immediately. No more turning fights. We use altitude and surprise, just as the Americans do. We assign our best pilots to bomber interception, where altitude matters most. We mass our fighters in larger formations to overwhelm the escorts through numbers. He paused. Long term? We need aircraft designed for this war, not the last one. We need to accept complexity if it brings capability. We need to protect our pilots so they survive to become veterans. And most critically, we need to match American industrial output, or none of the rest matters. That last point, Yamanaka said softly, may be impossible. Then we need to find a way to make this war shorter, Genda replied. Because in a long war of attrition against American industry, we've already lost. July 15th, 1943. Imperial Japanese Navy Ministry, Tokyo. The conference room on the third floor overlooked the Sumida River. But none of the 15 officers gathered around the mahogany table were admiring the view. Summer heat pressed through the windows, despite the early morning hour. Commander Genda's report lay before each of them. 47 pages of technical analysis, tactical assessment, and uncomfortable truth. Admiral Takejiro Onishi, architect of aggressive carrier tactics and one of the Navy's most forward-thinking minds, tapped the photograph of the Lightning's turbocharger with his pen. So, we're agreed that we cannot replicate this system in meaningful numbers before 1945 at the earliest? Captain Horikoshi, summoned from Yokosuka for this meeting, nodded grimly. The Kugisho Technical Bureau has studied every component. We can manufacture turbochargers. In fact, we have a program underway. But the Americans have a 5-year head start in production engineering. Their General Electric plant in Lynn, Massachusetts, produces more turbochargers in a month than we could produce in a year. And that's just one component. The same disparity exists for propellers, instruments, hydraulics, every system. What about the Ki-44? Asked a colonel from the Army Air Service, invited specifically because the Army's Nakajima fighter did employ turbocharging. We've fielded that aircraft successfully. In limited numbers, Horikoshi responded carefully. The Army-Navy rivalry was legendary. But today wasn't the time for institutional pride. And with significant reliability problems. The Americans have refined their turbocharger design through thousands of flight hours. They've solved the overheating issues, the turbine blade failures, the lubrication problems that we're still encountering. This isn't a question of whether we can build one turbocharger. It's whether we can build 10,000 reliable ones. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commander of the 3rd Fleet, leaned forward. Let's speak plainly. I've lost 63 aircraft over Bougainville in the last month. Most of them never even engaged the enemy. They were bounced from above by P-38s, shot down before they could climb to fighting altitude. My pilots are veterans. They're brave. They're skilled. And they're dying because we've sent them to fight in aircraft that cannot compete. His voice remained level, but his knuckles were white where he gripped the table edge. So, tell me what we do. Not in 1945. Now. Genda stood, moving to a large tactical map of the Pacific mounted on the wall. Red pins marked Japanese positions. Blue pins marked Allied advances. There was far more blue than there had been 6 months ago. We adapt our tactics to nullify the Lightning's advantages. First, we stop sending small formations against their bomber streams. The Americans typically deploy 16 to 24 P-38s as escorts. We've been sending 6 or 8 zeros. Basic mathematics says we lose. He moved red pins on the map. We concentrate our fighters. 30, 40, 50 aircraft in a single formation. Yes, It's wasteful of fuel and reduces our operational flexibility. But it gives us numbers sufficient to overwhelm the escorts through sheer volume. Some of us will die getting through, many of us, but some will reach the bombers. That's not tactics, Yamanaka said quietly. That's desperation. Yes, Genda agreed without hesitation. But it's realistic desperation. Second point, we abandon low-altitude patrol. Every Zero we have capable of reaching 25,000 feet should be held there, waiting. The P-38s have superior performance at altitude, but they're not invincible. If we're already high when they arrive, if we see them first and position correctly, we can make diving attacks and then extend away before they can bring their speed advantage to bear. A younger staff officer raised his hand. That means ceding all low-altitude airspace to their attack bombers and dive bombers, which are already operating with near impunity, Ozawa interjected. We might as well concentrate our forces where we can actually engage the enemy on something approaching equal terms. Genda continued. Third, we need to brief every pilot on the P-38's weaknesses. Yes, it has weaknesses. The cockpit heating is inadequate. Pilots at high altitude suffer from cold. The twin engines complicate emergency procedures. The concentrated armament is devastating, but requires precise aim. Spray and pray doesn't work when all your guns are in the nose. And most critically, the Lightning's roll rate at high speeds is poor. The control forces become extremely heavy, above 350 miles per hour. Shibata, who'd been quiet until now, added, Our pilots need to understand that they cannot dogfight with Zeros or Oscars. The Americans know this and won't try. But if they make a mistake, if they get slow trying to follow an evasive target, that's when they're vulnerable. A Zero can roll 3 times for every 1 P-38 roll at low speeds. If we can force them slow, we can kill them. How often will they make that mistake? Yamanaka asked. Rarely, Shibata admitted. Their training emphasizes discipline, but everyone makes mistakes eventually, and we need to be positioned to exploit everyone. Onishi stood, walking to the window. The morning sun glinted off the river below, off the city spreading in all directions. You're describing how we survive, how we trade casualties at less catastrophic rates. But I don't hear anything about how we win. The room fell silent. Finally, Genda spoke. We don't win, sir. Not in the air. Not against American production. They're building 7,000 fighters this year. We'll build 3,000 if we're fortunate. Next year they'll build 12,000. We'll build 4,000. The mathematics are inexorable. Then what's the point? A captain from the Naval General Staff demanded, his voice rising. What's the point of any of this if we've already lost? We haven't lost the war, Genda said carefully. We've lost the industrial competition. Those are different things. If we can make the war costly enough, long enough, painful enough, perhaps the Americans will negotiate rather than pay the price of total victory. But that requires us to maximize the effectiveness of every aircraft we do have, every pilot we can train, every resource we can marshal. Horikoshi opened a leather folder, extracting a series of blueprints. There are programs underway. The N-1KJ Shiden is entering production, a land-based fighter with performance approaching the P-38s. The Ki-84 from the Army shows promise. The J-2M will eventually overcome its teething problems. In 18 months, perhaps 2 years, we'll have aircraft that can compete technically. 18 months, Ozawa repeated. How many pilots will we have lost by then? How many experienced men who cannot be replaced? The question hung in the air like smoke. Everyone in the room knew the answer. Japanese pilot training had been shortened from 2 years to 6 months, then to 3 months. The Americans were training pilots in 6 months, but they were training 5,000 at a time. They could afford to have mediocre pilots learning on the job. Japan couldn't. Onishi turned from the window. I want this report distributed to every air group commander in the combined fleet. I want our tactics revised according to Genda's recommendations. I want every pilot briefed on the P-38's capabilities and limitations. He paused. And I want an honest assessment sent to the Naval Ministry. The Americans have won the technological race. We're now fighting to make their victory as expensive as possible. Yamanaka looked troubled. That's defeatist talk, Admiral. That's realistic talk, Captain, Onishi replied sharply. The alternative is to keep sending our pilots to die in aircraft that cannot compete, pretending that fighting spirit will overcome 1,200 horsepower turbocharged engines and half-inch machine guns. I won't do it. Our men deserve better. The meeting continued for another 2 hours, working through details of implementation, discussing how to present the findings to the more conservative elements of the command structure, debating the allocation of the new fighters once they entered service. But the fundamental truth had been acknowledged, even if not everyone in the room accepted it. When the meeting finally adjourned, Genda found himself standing with Shibata on the ministry steps, watching uniformed men hurry about their duties in the summer heat. Across the city, factories were working around the clock, building Zeros and Oscars and all the other aircraft that would have to hold the line until something better arrived. Do you think they'll listen? Shibata asked quietly. Genda lit a cigarette, considering. Some will. The ones who've seen combat recently, who've watched their formations get decimated. The old guard? He shook his head. They'll resist until reality forces their hand. But by then, it may be too late. It may already be too late. Perhaps. Genda took a long drag, watching the smoke dissipate in the breeze. But we have to try. Every pilot we save through better tactics, every bomber we shoot down through improved concentration of force, it all matters. Not because it will change the outcome, but because those men deserve leaders who understand what they're facing and don't send them to die uselessly. Shibata thought about the P-38 wreckage on Shortland Island, about the American pilot who died in that cockpit. The Americans were losing pilots too, losing them in numbers that would have crippled the Japanese Air Force. But they kept coming. They had the factories to build more fighters, the training programs to produce more pilots, the industrial depth to sustain losses that would be catastrophic for Japan. I'm going back to Rabaul tomorrow, Shibata said. Back to flying combat. You don't have to, Genda replied. Your technical expertise is valuable here. My flying skills are more valuable there. Shibata straightened his uniform. Someone needs to show the younger pilots how to fight lightnings, how to survive long enough to get close, how to exploit the small advantages we still have. He managed a tight smile. Besides, I want to shoot one down. For professional reasons. Genda understood. It wasn't about revenge or glory. It was about proving that the P-38, for all its technical superiority, wasn't invincible. That Japanese pilots, flying inferior aircraft, could still compete if they were smart and disciplined and very, very lucky. They watched the sun climb higher, burning off the morning haze. Somewhere to the south, over New Guinea or the Solomons or any of a dozen contested islands. Japanese and American fighters were already engaged in the daily struggle for air superiority. Men were dying in burning cockpits, parachuting into hostile jungles, ditching in the vast Pacific. Some flew P-38 Lightnings with their turbocharged engines and concentrated firepower. Some flew Zeros with their lightness and agility and inadequate armor. The technical analysis was complete. The reports were written. The Lightning's secrets were no longer secret. Japanese engineers understood exactly what made it superior, exactly why it dominated the Pacific skies. Understanding it didn't make it easier to defeat. Understanding it just made the disparity clearer, the challenge more daunting. But understanding also brought possibility. If you knew your enemy's strengths, you could work around them. If you knew your own weaknesses, you could compensate. It wouldn't be enough to win, but it might be enough to survive. And survival, in the summer of 1943, was victory enough. Genda dropped his cigarette, grinding it under his heel. "Fly smart, Commander. We've already lost too many good pilots to American technology. Don't add your name to that list." "I'll do my best, sir." They saluted, and Shibata walked away toward his staff car. Genda watched him go, then returned to the ministry to begin the bureaucratic battle of implementing the tactical changes they discussed. It would be difficult. The institutional resistance would be fierce. But the alternative was to keep fighting a losing war with losing tactics. And that was unacceptable. The P-38 Lightning had taught Japanese engineers that technical superiority mattered, that industrial capacity was a weapon as devastating as any bomb or bullet. It was a lesson bought with blood and wreckage, learned too late to change the war's trajectory, but perhaps soon enough to shape how Japan would fight the battles still to come. In hangars across the Pacific, mechanics would continue servicing Zeros for missions they weren't designed to win. In factories across Japan, workers would continue building aircraft that were obsolete before they left the assembly line. And in the sky, pilots would continue fighting against an enemy who could afford to make mistakes, to lose battles, to trade aircraft and pilots in numbers that would be suicidal for Japan. The Americans had examined Japanese fighters after Pearl Harbor and learned they'd underestimated their enemy. Now Japanese engineers had examined the P-38 Lightning and learned the same lesson. But knowing you're outmatched and being able to do something about it are very different things. The war would continue for 2 more years. The Lightnings would continue to dominate Pacific skies, escorting bombers ever closer to the Japanese home islands. New aircraft would emerge, the Shiden, the Hayate, eventually the desperate last-generation fighters that never reached production in meaningful numbers. But the fundamental equation wouldn't change. The P-38 wasn't just an aircraft. It was a statement. It said, "This is what a nation with unlimited industrial capacity, advanced technology, and tactical flexibility can produce. Match this if you can." Japan couldn't match it. That was the truth the engineers had discovered in the wreckage on Shortland Island, confirmed in the hangars of Yokosuka, and finally acknowledged in the conference rooms of Tokyo. Sometimes understanding your enemy is the first step toward defeating them. Sometimes it's just the first step toward understanding that defeat is inevitable.